Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 32, Hypnotism. And so, Beelzebub continued, at this 6th sojourn of mine, in person, on the surface of that planet Earth of yours, I decided to settle there for a long stay and to become a professional physician. I did indeed become one, only not such a physician as most of them are there, but I chose for myself the profession of what is called the physician hypnotist. I became such a professional there, firstly because during recent centuries only such physician professionals there obtain an entry to all their classes or castes of which I spoke, and since they enjoy great confidence and authority, ordinary beings are disposed to a sincerity towards them that permits them to penetrate, as is said, the inner world. Secondly, I decided to become such a professional in order also parallel with the attainments of my personal aims, to have the possibility at the same time of giving genuine medical assistance to certain of those unfortunates. Indeed, my boy, on all the continents there and among all the beings, to whatever class they may belong, there has been during recent times and there still is a great need for just such physicians. I may say that I already had a very wide experience in this specialty, having during my previous elucidation of certain subtle points of the psyche of individual favourites of yours, many times had recourse to methods used there by such a kind of physician. I must tell you that formerly your favourites, like all the other three-brained beings of the whole universe, were without that particular psychic property which permits them to be brought into what is called a hypnotic state. To get into that state became proper to your favourites, thanks to a certain combination obtained in their psyche, and derived from the disharmony of the functioning of their common presence. This strange psychic property had its rise soon after the destruction of Atlantis, and began to become finally fixed in the presence of every one of them from the time when their zoostat, that is, the functioning of their being consciousness, began to be divided in two, and when two entirely different consciousnesses, having nothing in common with each other, were gradually formed in them, namely those two different consciousnesses, the first of which was called by them simply consciousness, and the second, when they finally noticed it in themselves, was called and still continues to be called subconsciousness. If you try clearly to represent to yourself and to transubstantiate in the corresponding parts of your common presence all I am about to explain to you, you will perhaps then thoroughly understand nearly half of all the causes why the psyche of these three-brained beings who have taken your fancy and who breed on the planet Earth has finally become such a unique phenomenon. This psychic particularity, namely of falling into a hypnotic state, is, as I've already said, inherent to the three-brained beings only of this planet of yours, and one can therefore say that if they did not exist, then in all our great universe there would not exist in general even a being notion of hypnotism. Before explaining to you further about all this, it is here appropriate to emphasize that although during the last 20 centuries, almost the entire process of the ordinary waking existence of most of the three-brained beings who've taken your fancy, particularly of the beings of contemporary times, flows under the influence of this inherency of theirs, nevertheless, they themselves give the name hypnotic state only to that state of theirs during which the processes of this particular property flow in them acceleratedly, and the results of which are obtained concentratedly. And they fail to notice, or as they would say, they are not struck by irregular results of this inherency, which has recently become fixed in the ordinary process of their existence, because on the one hand, in the absence in them in general of a normal self-perfecting, they have not what is called a wide horizon, and on the other hand, arising and existing according to the principle itoklonos, it has already become inherent in them quickly to forget what they perceive. But when the said results of this inherency of theirs are obtained acceleratedly, concentratedly, then every kind of irregular manifestation, their own and those of others, become real to such a degree that they become acutely obvious even to their bob-tailed reason, and therefore unavoidably perceptible. But even if certain of them should by chance notice something illogical in their manifestations, or in the manifestations of others, then, thanks to the absence in them of the knowledge of the law of typicality, they at best ascribe it to the particularities of the character of the given beings. This abnormal particular property of their psyche was first constated by the learned beings of the city Gob, of the country Marel Plesi, and even then, when they made it a serious and detailed branch of science, which spread over the whole of the planet, under the name of non-responsible manifestations of personality. But later, when the turn of their regular process of reciprocal destruction came around again, this detailed branch of their science, which was then still comparatively normal, began, like all their good attainments, to be gradually forgotten and finally also entirely disappeared. And only many centuries later did this branch of their science again show signs of reviving. But thanks to the fact that at this period most of the learned beings there had already become learned beings of new formation, they sat upon this new revival so firmly that before the poor thing had time to develop, it soon found its way into their common, what is called, rubbish heap. And this happened in the following way. A humble learned being there, unlike his contemporaries, Mesmer by name, and by birth from what is called Austria-Hungary, once happened to notice clearly during certain of his experiments the real duality of consciousness in beings like himself. He was greatly impressed by this and devoted himself entirely to this question which interested him. Continuing to observe and to study, he almost succeeded in understanding the reason, but when later he began making practical experiments for the elucidation of certain details, well, it was just then that there began to be manifested towards him that particularity proper to the learned beings of new formation there. This particularity of the learned beings of the earth of new formation is called pecking to death. As this honest Austro-Hungarian learned being then began making his elucidating experiments, not as all the learned beings of the earth of new formation had in general become mechanized to do, he was, according to the custom there, very meticulously pecked to death. And this process of the pecking to death of this poor Mesmer was then so effective that it has already passed by its own momentum to the learned beings of the earth from generation to generation. For instance, all the books now existing there on the question of this hypnotism, and of such books there, and there are thousands there, always begin by saying that this Mesmer was nothing more nor less than a rogue with an itching palm and a charlatan of the first water, but that our honest and great learned beings very soon saw through him and prevented his doing any kind of mischief. The more the learned beings of recent times of this peculiar planet are themselves personally, in the sense of idiotism, squared, the more they criticize Mesmer and say or write concerning him every possible kind of absurdity to bring him into contempt. And in doing this, they criticize exactly that humble and honest learned being of their planet, who, if he had not been pecked to death, would have revived that science which alone is absolutely necessary to them, and by means of which alone perhaps they might be saved from the consequences of the properties of the Organkunde-Buffer. There is no harm in remarking here that just when I was leaving that planet forever, precisely the same was being repeated there as had occurred to this Mesmer, namely on this occasion an honest and humble learned being there from among the beings of the community France, after persistent and conscientious labours, came across the possibility of curing that terrible disease, the spreading of which also had in recent times assumed a general planetary character. This terrible disease is called there cancer. As this Frenchman also made practical experiments, not in the usual fashion there for the elucidation of the details of his discovery, other contemporary learned beings thereupon also manifested towards him that same particularity of theirs to peck him to death. Possibly now, in your presence, also there already begin to be crystallized the data for the engendering always in corresponding cases of the being impulse of an indubitable conviction concerning this fact, that thanks only to the learned beings of new formation there, in whom there has already been implanted the mentioned particularity, namely of not failing to peck to death every colleague of theirs who does not do the same as has already been fixed by the abnormally established conditions of ordinary being existence established there, they will never proceed in the presences of the three-brained beings of this ill-fated planet, Earth of yours, what is called the sacred Ant Guano, upon which, among other things, the very saintly Ashyata Shimash also counted. About this essence-loving hope of his, I chanced to learn during my investigations concerning his very saintly activities here. You, my boy, perhaps still do not know in what, namely, the cosmic process of the sacred Ant Guano consists. The sacred Ant Guano is the name of that process of perfecting the objective reason in the three-centered beings, which process proceeds by itself simply from the flow of time. As a rule, everywhere on those planets of our great universe, upon which three-brained beings breed, the perfecting of objective reason can proceed in them only from personal conscious labours and intentional sufferings. This sacred Ant Guano can proceed only in on those planets upon which, in general, all cosmic truths have become known to all the beings. And all cosmic truths usually become known to all on these planets, thanks to the fact that the beings of the given planet, who by their conscious labours learn some truth or other, share it with other beings of their planet, and in this way all the cosmic truths gradually become known by all the beings of the given planet, without any distinction. Thanks to this sacred process, intentionally actualized by our all-foreseeing, common endless Father, it is foreseen that in the three-brained beings of the given planet, during the process in their presences of the fundamental cosmic holy law of Triamazikamno, the superfluity of its third holy force thereby obtained, namely the force of the sacred reconciling, should by itself crystallize data in them for engendering that something which is what is called being ego-a-Taurasian will. Well then, the mentioned particular property recently newly fixed in the common presences of your favourites is that the functioning of their mentioned zoostat, or as they themselves will say, of their spiritual part, passes into that functioning of their common whole, which probably proceeds during their completely passive state, that is, during their sleep. And during this sleep of theirs, the entire functioning of the planetary body continues to remain such as it became proper to it to be during their waking state. In order that you should better represent to yourself and understand the results flowing from such an astonishing psychic property, you must first of all know about two facts actualized in the common presences of these favourites of yours. One of these facts is produced in their common presence thanks to the existing cosmic law of self-adaptation, of nature, and the other fact flows from the abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence established by them themselves, about which I have repeatedly spoken. The first fact is that from the time when, owing to their abnormal existence, there began to be formed in them what is called the two-system zoostat, that is, two independent consciousnesses, then great nature began gradually to adapt herself, and finally adapted herself to this, that after they arrive at a certain age, there begin to proceed in them two incliazanikshanas of different, what are called tempos, that is, as they themselves would say, two blood circulations of different kinds. From this certain age mentioned, each one of these incliazanikshanas of different tempo, that is to say, each blood circulation, begins to evoke in them the functioning of one of their mentioned consciousnesses, and vice versa. the intensive functioning of either consciousness begins to evoke in them the kind of blood circulation corresponding to it. The difference between these two independent kinds of blood circulation in their common presences is actualized by means of what is called tempo-Davlakshirian circulation, or, according to the expression there of what is called contemporary medicine, the difference of the filling of the blood vessels. That is to say, in the condition of the waking state, the centre of gravity of the blood pressure in their common presences obtains in one part of the general system of blood vessels, and in the condition of the passive state, in another part of the vessels. And the second fact, the fact ensuing from the abnormal conditions of the being existence of your favourites, is that when from the very beginning of the arising of their offspring, they intentionally try by every kind of means for the purpose of making them respond to these abnormal conditions around them, to fix in their logic-Nestorian localizations as many impressions as possible obtained exclusively only from such artificial perceptions as are again due to the results of their abnormal existence, which maleficent action of theirs towards their offspring they call education. Then the totality of all such artificial perceptions gradually segregates itself in their common presences, and acquires its own independent functioning, connected only as much with the functioning of their planetary body as is necessary, merely for its automatic manifestation. And the totality of these artificial perceptions is then perceived by them, owing to their naivety, as their real consciousness. But as for the sacred data for genuine being consciousness put into them by great nature, which consciousness ought to be possessed by them from the very beginning of their preparation for responsible existence, together with the properties inherent in them, which engender in them the genuine sacred being impulses of faith, hope and love, and conscience, these data, becoming gradually also isolated and being left to themselves, evolve independently of the intentions of the responsible beings, and of course also independently of the bearers of them themselves, and come to be regarded as what is called the subconsciousness. Thanks only to such in the objective sense maleficence, but according to their naive subject understanding benevolence towards their offspring, all the sacred data put in by great nature herself for forming in them their real being consciousness became isolated and remained during the entire period of their existence in their almost primitive state, and every kind of impression unavoidably perceived by means of the six being skenalis yonics, or in their terminology sense organs, present in their presences, for the specific perception of externals, by the way, they count them as 5, come to be localized and acquiring their isolated functioning gradually become predominant for the whole of their common presence. Although such a localization of accidentally perceived impressions is found in them, and although they are aware of its action, yet in respect of any functioning inherent in their planetary body, as well as in respect of the acquisition in their common presence of objective reason, it plays no part. All these impressions, intentionally or accidentally perceived, from which the said localizations are formed, ought to be in them only as material for confrontative logic, for their real being consciousness, which they should have in themselves, and their accidental results of the perception of which in their naivety they sometimes now confidently regard merely as reflexes of their, in their opinion, insignificant, what is called animal instinct. Only thanks to the single fact that your favourites, especially the contemporary ones, do not know at all, and even do not suspect, the necessity of at least adapting their famous education to the said subconsciousness of their offspring, but that they always and in everything intentionally assist every one of the rising generation to perceive impressions only from the abnormally artificial, then thanks only to this, when every one of them reaches the age of a responsible being, all his being judgments and all his deductions from them are always purely peculiarly subjective in him, and have no connection not only with the genuine being impulses arising also in him, but also neither with those general cosmic lawful phenomena, to sense by which reason is proper to every three-brained being, and by means of which there is established that connection between the all three-brained beings of all our great universe, for the collective fulfilment of the common universal functioning, for which purpose everything existing in the universe it just exists. For your wider understanding of this particular psychic state, it's necessary to tell you further that even up to now they arise with every kind of data for acquiring genuine being reason, and at their arising there are not yet in their presences any logic Nestorian growths, from which there is later localized and from which there is acquired the isolated functioning in them of the said false consciousness. But only later during their development and their preparation to become responsible beings, either by themselves or by their intentional directing of their, as they call them, parents or teachers, that is to say, responsible beings who undertake the responsibility of the preparation of the giving beings for responsible existence. They begin, as I said, to help intentionally in taking in and fixing only those impressions which later are data for the impulses corresponding to surrounding abnormally established conditions. And only then, being gradually formed, there just begins to be predominant in their common presence this said artificially formed consciousness of theirs. And the totality of these localized data, existing in their presences, and spiritualized in them for the genuine being consciousness which they call subconsciousness, not having and not acquiring any logic Nestorian growths for confrontation and criticism, but having from the very beginning only possibilities of engendering the sacred being impulses called faith, love, hope and conscience, always believes, always loves and always hopes in everything newly perceived. And so, when thanks to a change of tempo of their blood circulation, there is obtained a temporary suspension of the action of the localization of that false consciousness, which has already become the autocratic ruler of their common presences, thereby giving the sacred data of their genuine consciousness the possibility of unhindered blending with the total functioning of the planetary body during the period of their waking state. And then indeed, my boy, if the crystallization of data for engendering in that localization an idea of something opposite to that which has already risen in them, and somehow become fixed, is assisted in a corresponding manner, and if moreover the actions evoked by this idea are directed upon a disharmonized part of the planetary body, an accelerated change in it is possible. When during the period of the Tikli-Amishian civilization, the learned beings of the locality Maral-Plisi first constated in their common psyche the special possibility of such combinations and began to search for ways of intentionally bringing one another into this special state, they soon understood and found the possibility of actualizing this by means of what is called being Hambledzoin, namely that cosmic substance, the essence of which the three-brained beings of the contemporary civilization come close to understanding and which they called animal magnetism. Since for the explanation of the given case, and also perhaps for my following explanations, you must know more in detail concerning being Hambledzoin, I find it necessary before speaking further to inform you just now about this cosmic substance. Hambledzoin is nothing else than the blood of the Kesdjan body of the being. Just as the cosmic substances called in totality blood serve for nourishing and renewing the planetary body of the being, so also Hambledzoin serves in the same way for nourishing and perfecting the body Kesdjan. It's necessary to tell you that in general the quality of the composition of the blood in the three-brained beings and also in the common presences of your favourites depends on the number of the being bodies already completely formed. Blood in the presences of the three-brained beings may be composed of substances arising through the transformation of three separate independent what are called general cosmic sources of actualizing. The substances of that part of the being blood, which is designed by nature for serving the planetary body of the being, arise by means of the transformation of substances of that planet on which the given beings are formed and exist. But the substances which are designed for serving the Kesdjan body of the being, the totality of which is called Hambledzoin, are obtained from the transformation of elements of other planets and of the Sun itself, of that system where the given three-brained being has its place of arising and existence. Finally, that part of the being blood, which almost everywhere is called the sacred being Hambledzoin, and only on certain planets is called the sacred Aescaldian, and which part serves the highest part of the being called the soul, is formed from the direct emanations of our most holy Son Absolute. Substances required for the blood of the planetary body of the being enter into them through their first being food, or as your favourites say, through food. But the substances needed for coating and for perfecting the higher being body, Kesdjan, enter into their common presences through their, as they say, breathing, and through certain what are called pores of their skin. And the sacred cosmic substances required for the coating of the highest being body, which sacred being part of theirs, as I've already told you, they call soul, can be assimilated and correspondingly transformed and coated in them, just as in us, exclusively only from the process of what is called Aceritorinacian contemplation, actualized in the common presence by the cognized intention on the part of all the spiritualized independent parts. Although you will be able thoroughly to understand about all these cosmic substances with which the three independent being bodies are coated and perfected in the common presences of your favourites, only when, as I have already promised, I shall relate to you in general about the chief cosmic fundamental laws of world creation and world existence, nevertheless, for a fuller elucidation of our present theme, it is now necessary to explain a little about the changed form of the actualization in the common presences of your favourites of the second being food automatically taken in by them. At the beginning, after the destruction of the organ kunda buffer, when they, like all the other three-brained beings of our great universe, also began to have a full as Nitamnian existence, this second being food was normally transformed, and all the fundamental elements proper to it, those which arise from the transformation of their own planet, and those which flow into their atmosphere from the transformation in other concentrations of the solar system, were assimilated by their common presence, according to the definite data already present in them, and the superfluity of certain of its component elements, not used by individual beings, automatically passed, as in us, into the possession of the surrounding meritorious beings similar to them. But later, when, as I've already said, most of them began to exist in a way unbecoming to three-brained beings, great nature was constrained to change their Fulasnitamnian existence into an existence according to the principle of Etoklanos, and when gradually in the presences of most of them, those definite crystallizations foreseen by great nature, which crystallizations are the most important part of the composition of the second being food, and which when assimilated by beings are transformed into substances for the coating and for the further perfecting of their higher body Kesdjan, ceased, owing to their abnormal being existence, to be assimilated, either consciously or automatically for the purpose indicated. Then, in consequence of this, and also because the afflux of these substances transformed in other concentrations and getting into the atmosphere of the planets continued all the time to flow into the atmosphere of your planet, the result was that on this ill-fated planet, among your unfortunate favourites, there arose still quite another definite disease, which has already become quite definite in its harmful action upon them. The point is that not being used up for their predetermined purpose, the said definite cosmic crystallizations become, during certain displacements of their atmosphere, concentrated in certain of their atmospheric strata, and entering into them from time to time, dependently on various external surrounding conditions, and also on the inner state of the common presences of your favourites, which, by the way, arises in them chiefly from the form of their mutual relationship, just into them as into the apparatuses foreseen by nature in general for the transformation of cosmic substances needed for serving the aims of the most great general cosmic Trogo-Auto-Egocrat, and not meeting their substrata corresponding to the requirements of the lawful process of Jarklom, they, that is, these cosmic crystallizations, during their subsequent free completed evolutions or involutions, for passing into other crystallizations proper to this planet, and before completing their transformations, produce upon planetary bodies, thanks already to other accidental factors, that action by which such a mentioned specific disease newly arisen there is characterized. Here it's opportune to notice that such a disease there, having such a specific cause, was named differently by your favourites at different times on different parts of the surface of their planet, and the contemporary beings likewise name it differently and also wiseacre differently regarding the explanations of its cause. From among the great number of names of this disease of theirs, the most widely spread there at the present time are gripe, influenza, Spanish influenza, dengue, and others. As regards the introduction into themselves of the second kind of being food, which continues among beings even still up to now, then since they lost the possibility of existing according to the Fulasnitamnian principle, certain of the ingredients of the substances of the second being food continue to serve only for assisting the transformation of the first being food, and for removing from them the planetary body certain elements already used by them. Now let us speak further about a particular psychic property of your favourites, and about my activities at the time, among them in the capacity of a physician specialist, when I acted upon them by means of this particular psychic property of theirs. Through this hypnotism, or as they prefer to say, this branch of their science, arose and became official only recently, yet it had already had time to become for them another of the very serious factors which brought about a still greater confusion of their psyche, already muddled enough without this in the majority of them, and which still further deranged the functioning of their planetary body. After I had become a professional, namely a physician hypnotist, I grew a little interested also in this official science of theirs, so that when I later made my usual researches concerning various serious questions, as for instance the investigations concerning the results of the activities of the very saintly Ashieta Shimash, and chanced to come across something bearing upon questions of this branch of their science, I elucidated to my reason also this misunderstanding question there. As the automatic impelling causes which have become their usual for contemporary beings, for the revival also of such a branch of their contemporary science, were exceedingly peculiar, and even as they themselves would say, piquant facts, it will in my opinion be very interesting to tell you a little more in detail also about this said revival. Although contemporary learned beings there affirm that the beginning of this branch of their science was made by a certain English professor named Bard, and that it was developed by a French professor Charcot, but in reality this was not so at all. From my detailed investigations of this said question, by the way, it became also clear that the former Bard had unmistakable signs of the properties of a Hasnamus, and the latter Charcot had the typical properties of a mama's darling. And terrestrial types of this kind, particularly the contemporary ones, can never discover anything quite new. And indeed it appeared that this matter proceeded there in the following way. A certain Italian abbot, Pedrini by name, was in his town what is called a confessor for a convent. To this abbot-confessor there often came for confession a nun named Ephrosinia. From the stories told about her, it seems that she frequently fell into a certain particular state, and while in this state, she displayed manifestations unusual for her environment. During confession, she complained to the abbot Pedrini that at times she was unmistakably under the influence of diabolical suggestions. Everything she herself said, and the stories circulated about her, interested the abbot Pedrini, and he became very desirous of convincing himself personally about them. Once during confession, he tried by all possible means to evoke frankness in this nun, and he got to know, among other things, that this nun novice had had a lover, who had once given her his portrait framed in a very beautiful frame, and that she permitted herself during periods of her resting from her prayers to admire this picture of her sweetheart, and that, as it seemed to her, the diabolical suggestion proceeded in her just at these said periods of her resting. All this, told frankly by the nun, still further excited the interest of the abbot Pedrini, and he decided at all costs to find out the cause of it. And with this aim in view, he first of all asked the nun Ephrosinia to be sure to bring with her to the next confession the portrait of her sweetheart together with the frame. At the next confession, the nun took with her this said portrait. There was nothing very special about it, but the frame indeed was unusual, it being all encrusted with mother-of-pearl and various coloured stones. While the abbot and the nun were together examining the portrait in the frame, the abbot suddenly noticed that something particular began to proceed with the nun. First she became pale, and for a certain time she became, as it were, petrified, and then there began with her on the spot precisely all the details, the same manifestations which proceed there among the newly married at what is called the first night. After all this, the abbot Pedrini desired still more to make clear to himself all the causes of such an unusual manifestation. But as regards the nun, she recovered 2 hours after the beginning of this particular state of hers, and it was discovered that she knew and remembered nothing of what had happened to her. As the abbot Pedrini himself alone could not unravel this phenomenon, he turned for help to his acquaintance, a certain Dr. Bambini. Well, when the abbot Pedrini told everything in detail to the Dr. Bambini, the latter also became very much interested, and from then on they both began to occupy themselves with the elucidation of it all. They first made various elucidating experiments upon the nun Ephrosinia herself, and after several what are there called seances, they noticed that this nun invariably fell into such a peculiar state of hers only when her gaze rested rather a long time on one of the brilliant coloured stones, and which is called a Persian turquoise, which was among the adornments of the frame of this portrait. But later, when this same Persian turquoise they continued to make their elucidating experiments upon, But later, when with this same Persian turquoise they continued to make their elucidating experiments upon others, they then soon became categorically convinced, firstly, that in almost any of the three-brained beings without distinction of sex, who gazes for a long time at shining and brilliant objects of a certain kind, there begins to proceed a state similar to the one which proceeded with the first subject of their experiments. And secondly, they noticed further that the form of manifestation of the subject during the state varies, and is found to be dependent on the former being experiences, which chance to be predominant, and on the shining objects with which a connection was accidentally established during such experiences of theirs. Well, my boy, when the information concerning such observations, deductions, and experiments of these two beings belonging to the community Italy was spread among the contemporary learned beings of new formation, and many of these latter also began wiseacring about it, And finally, when by chance, as it usually happens among them, they learned that it is possible in beings similar to them, when in this state, to change in an accelerated way the impressions formerly fixed in them to new ones, then certain of them began to use this particular psychic property inherent in them for the purpose of curing. And from then on, such a means of curing was called by them a hypnotic cure. And those beings who were occupied with the means of curing, physician hypnotists. The question as to what this state of theirs is and why it obtains in them remains an open one for them even up till now, and reply to it they cannot. From that time on there began to appear, and there exist till now, hundreds of every possible kind of theory, and thousands of thick books devoted to this question, thanks to which the minds of the ordinary three-brained beings of this ill-fated planet, already sufficiently muddled without this, became still more muddled. This branch of their science has perhaps come to be for them more maleficent than the fantastic inventions of the ancient Hellenic fishermen and of the contemporary beings of the community Germany. Thanks merely to this branch of their science, there was acquired in the psyche of the ordinary beings of this ill-fated planet several still new forms of what are called being Kaukali, that is, essential strivings, which became cast into the forms of definite teachings, existing there under the names of Anoclinism, Darwinism, Anthroposophism, Theosophism, and many other names also ending with ism, thanks to which even those two data of their presences, which still helped them to be at least a little as it is becoming to three-centred beings to be, finally disappeared in them. And these essential data, which have until recently been in them engendered in them, the being impulses they called patriarchality and religiousness. The branch of this contemporary science was the cause not only of the acquiring by their common presences of several further new maleficent Kaukali, but it was also the cause of the derangement in many of them of the, without this, abnormal functioning of their psyche, which to their great misfortune was already long before this disharmonized up to the degree of what is called Alnocurian cacophony. You'll understand this well if I tell you that during that curing practice of mine, there, when I later became a physician hypnotist, and existed mostly on the continent called Europe, and on other countries situated near to it, almost half of my patients consisted of those who were ill only because of this said maleficent science of theirs, which had become widely spread there. And this was obtained because when these learned beings of new formation began writing various books about these questions, with every kind of fantastic theory, many ordinary beings there began to read them, and became crazy with their fantasies, and themselves began trying to evoke this hypnotic state in each other, and as a result they brought themselves to the point of becoming my patients. Among such patients of mine were the wives of husbands who, having chanced to read these works, wished to suggest to their wives their egoistic wishes. For similar reasons, children of unreasonable parents became my patients. Various men who were found to be under the orders, or as it is said there, under the thumb of their mistresses, and so on and so forth. And all of this only thanks to the fact that these sorry learned beings of new formation cooked up their Hasnamusian theories concerning this distressing state of theirs. None of the theories now current among them concerning this question of hypnotism even approximate in the least to reality. Most recently, by the way, when I was on this ill-fated planet, a new maleficent means began to flourish there for doing the same with the psyche of the beings there, as there did and still does this branch of their science, hypnotism. And this new maleficent means they call psychoanalysis. You must without fail also know that when beings of the period of the Tikliamishian civilization constated for the first time about this particular psychic property of theirs, and soon made it clear that by its means they could destroy in each other certain properties particularly unbecoming to be in them, then the process itself of bringing someone into this state began to be regarded by them as a sacred process, and was performed only in their temples before the congregation. But in the presences of your contemporary favourites, not only does there absolutely not arise any being impulse of contrition about this essential property of theirs, and not only do they not consider its concentrated manifestation intentionally yet unavoidably evoked by them as sacred, but they have already adapted it, the process itself and the accidentally obtained results, for serving them as a means for tickling certain consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer firmly fixed in them. For instance, even when they meet together for one or another established patriarchal ritual like a wedding, baptism, saint's day and so on, one of the great diversions is trying to bring one another into the said state. It's lucky that they still do not know, and it must be hoped that they never will know, other methods besides the one discovered by the beings of the community Italy, the Abbot Pedrini and the Dr. Bambini, namely the gazing at a shining brilliant object, by means of which method, as I've already told you, certain of them can indeed be brought into such a mentioned concentrated state. End of chapter.